Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Начинаем.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Now let's start our session. We're going to talk about money. It's not going to be easy to do it after a session dedicated to humanism. And now this is a traditional session for the Verona Forum. I remember that in past years we would discuss the new system of payments to make it more accessible to everyone. We talked about financial services, which must be more affordable for more people. We talked about investments required to companies and that should become more accessible and more democratic. Today we are seeing a contrary trend because the macroeconomic and political factors are all having a negative impact, and they are pushing towards the opposite direction, and they entail additional expenses for companies, thus also limiting access to finances to citizens. So investments will become more expensive or even inaccessible. Technologies, on the one hand, make life easier, but politics and the macroeconomic context do the opposite. However, the situation is constantly changing. Risks are changing as well. So today we'll try and give a global view of the possible future changes. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Farid Osmanov, Director General of the Central Bank of the Republic of Azerbaijan; Mikhail Mamuta, Head of Microfinance from the Central Bank of Russia; Valery Weisberg, Chief Analyst of Region, an investment company in Russia. Then we have Igor Maximtsev, Rector of the St. Petersburg State University of Economics; Ulvi Mansorov, Executive Director of the Azerbaijan Investment Company; Dmitry Mitayev, Executive Secretary of the Scientific and Technical Council of the Eurasian Economic Commission; and Alex Kreiner, founder of Kreiner Analytics. I am happy to welcome you all here, and I hope it's going to be an interesting discussion. It's the first time that I come to Azerbaijan, and I'm very impressed by what I have seen, and also based on what I have read. It is a clear example of a multipolar world. Here in Baku, we have many paths to invest, and a multipolar world means that there are different poles, and from poles, sometimes you get cold winds as well. That's why they're called poles. The economy of Azerbaijan now is showing great results. So the first question is for you, Mr. Osmanov. These new challenges, how have they impacted the financial system? Do you have any problems in payments, including payments to Russia? And what measures are being implemented by the Central Bank of Azerbaijan to solve these issues or to create new opportunities for development?
Здравствуйте. Спасибо большое за вопрос.
Thank you very much for this question. I would like once again to welcome all the participants in this forum. As for your question, I would like to highlight that as a Central Bank of Azerbaijan, we carefully follow and we carefully study the current geopolitical and geoeconomical situation in terms of macroeconomic stability and market stability in general. Now, what we are seeing is that the sanctions against financial institutions and banks in Russia and their exclusion from the SWIFT system are not impacting on financial operations between Russia and Azerbaijan. What we are seeing is that the volume of import operations between Russia and Azerbaijan compared to the same period last year, well, in the 9 months of 2022, we've seen an increase by 30% of such operations. They amount to 2 billion US dollars. We can say that bank transfers are growing quite actively between Russia and Azerbaijan. And so we can see that the bank transfers between our countries are growing with a positive dynamic. I would like to stress that today most Azerbaijani banks have a correspondence banks accounts in Russian banks. So we can say that the situation is stable and the dynamics is once again positive. Let me add that that finance is an integral part of our lives. How is the geopolitical situation impacting our life as well as technologies? Well, startups are currently more flexible and able to adapt to the needs of consumers. And so they provide active and affordable financial services to their users and consumers. They solve the financial problems that large banks are not able to solve right now. Now, in the Azerbaijani Central Bank has introduced a set of measures and strategies in its programs. The Azerbaijani Central Bank is launching a strategy for the development of payment systems, including 5 directions, 5 pillars. The first, we are focusing on national payment systems, including the legal platform related to it, to ensure financial inclusiveness and inclusion, to also improve the knowledge of people in the field of finance. A law will soon be approved on the banking standards, so that the financial system of startups and financial technologies can be integrated. I also would like to mention a few numbers. What is digitization doing for us? In recent years, we've seen a rapid increase in contactless payments. In the last year, contactless payments have grown by have doubled, and in the last 9 months, the share of contactless payments has grown by 19%, which means that people are becoming more innovative and they're embracing digital payments. The culture of digital payments is becoming more and more accessible. Thank you very much. You've anticipated my question on technologies. I seem to understand that they are not stopping. In fact, we are already seeing some effects. And even contactless payments have become very common here. Thank you very much. Now, we've mentioned technological aspects. I would like to remind all our speakers that we only have a certain amount of time for each speech because we have to close on time, hopefully. Now, in our lives, we can sometimes do unexpected things thanks to technologies. Some technologies have become very common, and they've become a sort of a big equalizer, because through technology we can do things that we were not able to do before. But we are faced with the geopolitical and macroeconomic problems, as we mentioned before. So now I'd like to turn to Russia, and I have a question on technological companies. Considering the need to restructure the economy, what do you think about the opportunity of giving these new companies, these new startups, access to financing? What other tools, other than traditional loans, can be made available to them by Russian banks? So what would you say about the general situation in Russia? Thank you. I am also quite impressed. I was impressed by the previous session, and I would love to keep on talking about humanism, languages, and culture. But unfortunately, we're here to talk about more trivial things such as money and finance. When in this field, too, the situation is not too bad, because, after all, it is a sector that requires a good amount of creativity. Those who work in the field of finance know that often people, after making a financial transaction, feel the need to write a poem, especially when they're innovative companies or startups. They often have this enthusiasm, this creative spirit, and they have a very important role also in the restructuring of the economy. Now, this restructuring is something that many countries need to do. Russia is no exception. We are developing a strategy for financial markets until 2030. And this strategy is now being negotiated with the government, and it's going to be soon approved. The financial sector, because it is the monetary driver of the economy, can step in where it is profitable, or in sectors that are beneficial for the economic development of the entire country. As a central bank, we plan several measures for banks, for fintechs, and for companies on the stock market. We try and support projects aimed at restructuring the economy. For a long time, the financial sector will still be dominated by large banks, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. But banks are not enough anymore to meet all the needs of the market. The market has changed. We find innovative new companies which often work by taking high risks, and these risks are too high for traditional banks. So we are seeing a new development on the capital market that is looking at these innovative, risky companies too. The stock exchange might not seem like a suitable place for small companies. Only big players are there. It's not necessarily true. Everything depends on the ability to find an efficient solution. It should be said that in recent years we've been building a new infrastructure on the stock market to also welcome rapidly growing companies. This is what is being done at the stock exchange in St. Petersburg. The role of the stock market is to create the right conditions to list small companies too. This work is also supported by a national project of the first Deputy Minister, Andrei Biozo. I know that he will participate in this forum. I don't know whether he's going to talk about this, but still, thanks to this project, we are able to subsidize many of the costs that these small innovative companies need to bear in order to be listed on the stock exchange. Today, we already see quite a few SMEs working in the metal or chemical sector, or companies managing welfare activities, etc., that are being listed. Our analysis shows that companies that received our support are successful in their growth. For these new companies, this also means being known and being able to also improve their governance and better transparency, thus exploiting their full potential. At first, companies issue bonds, and in this way, they prepare for an IPO. This is the normal process. All those who started with bonds then try and also work on the stock market. There are different ways to bring together new companies with the financial market, but in order to be successful in the exercise, we need a new taxonomy. We need to classify and find those companies that are rapidly evolving and that can have an impact on the restructuring of the economy starting from 2023. The plan is for the state to support mainly those companies that have the greatest impact on the restructuring of the economy. This is our plan. So they need to show that they have a high growth potential. I think that this will allow us to see more investments as well, and also we will be able to stimulate the interest to invest. This is a project that is open to our friendly countries, but we will open to all the others as well. Thank you. Well, as journalists, we are also waiting for the IPO phase. We're always very anxious. It's the most interesting phase. It's at the time of an IPO that a company becomes a listed company. Now, how can companies be prepared to enter the IPO phase? What is the starting point? Well, this is a very good question. When we build this investment structure, halfway through there is a sort of a gap, because when companies start to grow, they normally find some funds, they grow up to a certain level, and then they stop. There's a stop point, and then there's a rate of mortality for companies at this stage. Now, our intention is to never have any gaps and prevent companies to face this block. We have developed several measures, such as crowdfunding, but there are also many new digital opportunities. A few years ago, we approved a law on digital platforms, and now these platforms are monitored. We have a register of platforms. 60 digital platforms have already joined this register. Unfortunately, these platforms are now too small to move on to the IPO stage. This is a very interesting project. It's raised the interest of investors and also of those who want to attract investments. Our task is to ensure the efficiency of this mechanism. In 3 years, the market, namely from 2020 until 2022, this market segment has grown by threefold. Still talking about national projects, now companies can fund most of their costs through crowdfunding mechanisms. We know that crowdfunders are now cooperating with stock exchanges. So what happens? Companies sometimes start with crowdfunding, they grow, then they are listed, and at that point they can attract investments through bonds and possibly through an IPO as well. Crowdfunding doesn't mean having a debt. If we want to make an analogy with banks, crowdfunding is also the opportunity to attract money through a mechanism of closed subscription. So there's a whole mechanism that combines crowdfunding, the stock exchange, and companies to make sure that these companies can grow and develop. However, we need to disseminate information and knowledge and awareness. We need to think about education, and I thank your agency in particular, Interfax, because I know that you do cover these projects in the media. As a central bank, we launched several special training courses with the name Money for Business, and we organize several webinars. We try and involve as many companies as possible. But what is truly important is information.
У нас, надеюсь, будет работа.
So we have 2,000 companies taking advantage of this mechanism. That's impressive, even though I know that many companies are cautious about investing due to higher risks and higher risk for default. And in some cases, these risks have become threefold. So there is always some who have a positive outlook and others that will say that the same outlook is very negative. So at this point, I would like to ask Valery Weisberg from Likio. I would like to ask him how is the market tackling this turbulent moment? What are the new tools that are available, and what tools have become obsolete? Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here in this important forum. We've talked about the stock markets in the various phases of the economic cycle. We've talked about resources, moving on to yearly markets, and vice versa. So for a few weeks, the stock exchange was suspended. The Bank of Russia increased interest rates in a much more decisive way compared to last year. But as soon as the stock exchange reopened, we saw that rates decreased. With the decrease of the Bank of Russia, profitability decreased to around 10% for long-term, and investors were buying, and rates went down. So there was a brief inversion, but bond prices became stable again, similarly to what happened in 2014-2015, when corporate bonds had higher premiums than the average of the market, and that period lasted for a few months. Once we had the information on the second quarter results, we have seen more activity, unlike what happened in 2014-15. Companies started issuing many securities, and this was different from what happened in 2014, where securities were issued in the very short term, with a short maturity. Now the companies from the real economy are quite active, also with longer maturity securities. and companies might have lost interest in ratings, but that hasn't happened. We have 4 accredited rating agencies, and the number of companies who gave up on rating is very small. And everything that has been said about default can be confirmed. I can say at the beginning we were expecting less than 10 in terms of default. Now we're expecting much more, but definitely less than what was seen in 2014. That is to say, the quality of issuing companies is higher, much higher. So, talking about the efforts of the central bank in terms of investments, we can say that measures taken have borne positive results. In 2021, Russian companies had about 3.1 trillion rubles in profits, and pension funds, non-state pension funds, also had good results despite the turbulent period. These funds have the Russian stock exchange has about 30 million clients, and some of them saw their had their resources frozen, even though they were not included in the list of sanctioned individuals. 100 billion rubles have been frozen to date, with negative repercussions on investors. They have less possibilities. But in the month of July and August, we saw that individual resources on the stock exchange were back to increase. We're increasing again. We saw some inflows from abroad, which testifies to the trust in the Russian currency, which is also a result of the central bank policy. Now, the rate of the central bank is similar to that of September 2021. Today, the central bank is holding a meeting, and we believe that the rate won't change. We can say overall that the market is functioning again regularly. Again, in September and October, the investments were considerable. In October, there was a slight decrease. There were withdrawals from banks, but now we are seeing some flows back, and the profit margins for state bonds are acceptable again. And the Minister Siloano, Minister of Finance, has advertised investments in state bonds. Investors have had a positive reaction. We have had 3 sales collecting more than 3 auctions collecting more than 3 million rubles overall, and so we believe that this line will be kept by the ministry. Of course, there are difficulties. There is a decrease in the liquidity of the secondary market. There is less liquidity, but the market is still working. And in Russia, we have a very good platform to attract investments from abroad. and from Azerbaijan, from Kazakhstan, and from Russia, issuers have bought bonds through the Russian stock exchange, and from August we have the possibility to also have investments in Chinese yuan, and the profitability margin is a bit less compared to continental China. However, we are receiving a lot of money. The infrastructure is efficient, and I hope that for our colleagues from Azerbaijan and other countries, I hope that they will be interested in finding collaborators in Russia. Well, thank you. This is a very interesting situation. It's a picture of what is happening. And I've heard very important key terms such as trust for the ruble. This is fundamentally important. It's crucial. We can now move on to more global issues, so we can take a look at these issues from the point of view of the St. Petersburg University of Economics. I recently went there, and I was surprised to learn that in during history, this university was named after Parmelo Togliatti. Mr. Maximtsev, in your opinion, what global financial model can we have, and how can we create it if it is viable at all? Well, thank you for your question, dear colleagues. I am very pleased to be here again in this forum, this time in Baku. I would like to thank Professor Fallico and all of the organizing team, and I would like to thank Baku for welcoming us and for letting us enjoy the beauties of this wonderful city. As regards global change, well, from the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen changes, instability, military conflicts, and of course, all of this they are all sources of concern for the future. We cannot give stable forecasts saying that there will be a development of the financial system, because we have a number of unknown elements. And in my brief intervention, I'd like to underline some interesting proposals. So recently we have seen a lack of trust towards the US dollar for raw materials. National currency payments are becoming more and more widespread, and we no longer have the USD used as the only currency used all over the world. So all the limitations started in 2014 are having negative repercussions all over the globe, and these changes are taking place because they are linked to changes in the economy of the Russian Federation, but they're also having influences on other countries' economies. And we should consider the payment situation in the greater Eurasian place, because when there are problems due to external factors, such as financial flows and economic systems, we have also, in this case, we have external factors influencing all of these systems. In states and individual companies still need an economic growth, but at this point there is a fight to be included in regional islands of growth. And after all of these global processes we have seen in recent years, we are now moving towards integrations or unions that can ensure the development and well-being of companies, states, and people. At the same time, we are seeing that the whole system is not stable yet. We need a wider viewpoint, and we should probably think of one digital currency in the Eurasian space, and that unified single digital currency would probably be very helpful in paying for good flows, for financial payments as well. So in this here we need to use the SWIFT experience, but the system needs to be at a completely different technical level. We need to ensure that all countries can access that currency equally, and this should be true for all Eurasian countries, because of course, we have the energy issue, which the energy sector that needs rapid payments for supply, and it's worth discussing a single currency in this sector. There are several tools that should be strengthened. So we should develop reciprocal payment systems in national currencies. So giving up dollars, especially for energy resources. And as I said, an important issue is that of creating shared Eurasian currencies. We will probably reach this, but before that we need to work on the professional and human trust towards our forum and our colleagues. So we need to understand how to move forward in this direction. My suggestion is to think of a shared electronic payment system within the Eurasian space with the participation of the larger Eurasian space. Creating a shared rapid and electronic payment system. The second point is payments with the participation of regional banks and bank institutes. They already exist, but they should be strengthened. We should work on projects for the Eurasian region based on the financial structures of Russia and of the world. We just heard an example yesterday at the beginning of the forum, the railways between Azerbaijan and Iran. The Russian railways are also participating, and several companies from Russia are participating in this project. This is an example that shows how trust can be built, and that is necessary. Very likely we will have to go back to venture mechanisms, which is a consolidated experience, because these mechanisms for venture financing will enable us to move forward more rapidly. It is worth creating a Eurasian fund for venture financing, but that has to be tackled by business and governments in our states. I'm happy to be here at the forum because this is an arena that enables us to exchange experiences all year round, and to strengthen the experience of our states, and to build mutual respect and trust.
И, как мы знаем, Азербайджан как раз
Thank you very much. We know that Azerbaijan is a good example of what you were explaining. So now let me introduce our next speaker. And I have this question for Mr. Mansourov, which of course is related to investments, where he's an expert. How are the new current challenges impacting investment flows in the region? And in this context, how is the interest of foreign investors changing towards your republic? Well, thank you very much for this question. In principle, as we already heard, the world is going through a time of economic disruption. I could make many examples. We are witnessing inflation in all countries. We are seeing an increase of logistic costs. We are also experiencing problems due to the higher costs of energy resources. Now, this all has an impact on economic activities and on the behavior of economic actors. 2 years ago, when the pandemic started, in many areas of the world, the activity of investors was erased. This year, as a company involved directly in investment flows, we are seeing investments restarting in our regions. Most investments are in the supply chains and in logistics. There are still difficulties due to the higher prices of energy resources in exporting countries. For this reason, we are negotiating with our colleagues abroad to ensure their investments in Azerbaijan. Talking about specific sectors, I could mention, first of all, the building of new companies, the creation of new companies in Azerbaijan. Geographically, European or Asian producers who export their goods to faraway countries on the other side of the continent, well, for them, the problems are made worse not only by higher costs, but also by the shipment times that have become much longer. They are looking for alternatives. Some of them are waiting to see how the gas situation and the logistics situation is going, but there are also more proactive companies that are trying to react. They're all trying to minimize the costs for their products, and they're trying to look for cheaper ways to bring their products to consumers. So Azerbaijan, in this perspective, is a very advantageous region for investors. First of all, because the main drivers for foreign investors are cost reduction, the possibility to access markets with lower energy prices, and also the possibility to access countries with a better logistics. As you know, Azerbaijan is crossed by the new Silk Road, also known as a strategic corridor that will connect Europe to Asia. And so the geographical position of Azerbaijan is very advantageous. We have infrastructures, we have natural resources, we have manpower, we offer political stability. All these factors create an environment that makes investors feel safe. And this gives foreign investors the chance to start their productions here as well. It's not about relocating production. In this case, some investors are building additional facilities to support their work and their business. Also, in Azerbaijan, we have tried and tested logistic routes with lower costs. The cost of electricity in Azerbaijan is lower than the world average. So these are all reasons why many European countries would like to set up shop here, to start production sites here, to export their products to Asian countries from here. There is a lot of interest, and they're not just interested in Azerbaijan, they're interested in the entire region. As you know, Azerbaijan has already achieved a certain success, and it is still working on the project of the corridor that will connect us to Asia and the Asian countries. All the countries along this corridor can participate. The competition between countries is set to grow. They will all want to attract foreign investments. And so in this context, I think I can say that what Azerbaijan can offer as an investment environment will become even better in the future. You talked about possibility to invest in production facilities in Azerbaijan, and you also talked about logistics. You didn't really talk about oil and gas. You did say that something is being done. Is there any interest in this sector? Well, yes, in Azerbaijan, oil and gas is the core story. You know that investors have shown less interest in oil and gas. In the past, it was a global trend, but now this interest has decreased. Given what we see in the world, high prices. So we've seen a drop in the interest of investors. Investors prefer to look at other industries. But Azerbaijan, of course, wants to increase its gas exports. And to this purpose, we'll have to strengthen our infrastructure and also further develop the sector as a whole. The press is also writing that there is a lot of interest from foreign investors in these projects. There's also a lot of interest from strategic investors who would like to participate in this expansion of the infrastructure and consolidation of the infrastructures. But in addition to oil and gas, there are other sectors as well that are connected to energy. Let's think of renewable sources of energy. Now, that is also a very important sector, because energy prices have increased for traditional sources. The alternative sector of renewables will become even more attractive and interesting for investors. In the past, there were many doubts on renewables. Now we don't. And in Azerbaijan, we have many foreign countries that are already using alternative sources of energy successfully. Often, these players ask Azerbaijani investors to participate in their projects. We also have another advantage. As I mentioned, we have a very good geographical position. We enjoy a lot of sun, by the way, and we have a lot of wind, and that's good for solar and wind energy. I'm referring in particular to the Acheron Peninsula and the coast of the Caspian Sea, and also the recently freed area in Karabakh. Well, yes, these are fantastic resources. Now, we started to talk about the possible new payment systems. I would like to continue on this topic with you, Mr. Anatolich, because I know, Dmitry Michaev, because I know that you have many projects in this field. What are the possibilities offered by these new payment methods, and how can they help in the existing integration? Well, thank you very much. I would like to continue on the topic that Professor Maximtsev already mentioned. What kind of architecture or financial architecture would be possible in Greater Eurasia? And also, what is the tension suffered by the financial system? Because one thing is a crisis, and another thing is a collapse, the collapse of a system. The third possibility is to have a disaster. If a catastrophe, a disaster is inevitable, then you need to try and govern it. According to many indicators, the public debt GDP ratio has already gone above record levels. The American Treasury forecasted that this level would be reached in 2030, but it's been reached much sooner. From the Middle Ages, we know that such periods were normally accompanied by the nights of the apocalypse and with deep crises. Now, last year already, and yesterday we heard about it from Igor Ivanovich Sechin, he did explain that we are faced with high inflation levels. In some countries, inflation has reached 45% in the production, in the manufacturing sector, and this will inevitably have repercussions on the inflation suffered by consumers. Another problem we have to solve is the following. Why Europe or why China? In terms of exports of high technology, Europe was doing 5 times better than the United States, and it was also doing better than China. In the past, Europe exported 600, 700 billion worth of high technology, the US 150 billion. And this number was already declining. So the liquidation of Europe, as someone called it yesterday, means that production will be shifted to the United States. The trigger of this process is the pyramid of derivatives that you see here on the slide. 10, 15 years ago, this was already called as a weapon of mass destruction. This pyramid of derivatives still exists. It keeps on growing. And in the interest rates have also grown. In this context, activities could decline by 5 times. But an alternative exists, an alternative is possible. If we look at Eurasia and the Eurasian integration, we can find an alternative in energy resources. The Eurasian Union by itself cannot cover the entire need for energy. But in cooperation with the Shanghai Cooperation and with BRICS, we can obtain much higher results. The real role of the Russian economy in the global economy is 5 times higher than the indexes that are traditionally communicated by the media. So the energy balance is very solid, is very robust. Now, let me focus on initiatives and proposals. The most reliable opportunity is to create a new financial infrastructure and reform the International Monetary Fund. This, of course, requires political negotiations, but that would be an opportunity. By reforming the IMF, countries should be allocated different shares and quotas. At the moment, the IMF is based on only 4 currencies, but in an envisaged reform, this could change. Different forms of integrations are possible. The first one is the Eurasian Union. Some calculations show how a digital Eurasian currency could look like. Then the Shanghai Organization could also issue a currency, and then we have the BRICS. These are projects that are already under scrutiny. In the case of BRICS, this work was launched and promoted by the Russian president. We already have a roadmap and we know how we need to proceed. We are working on the relations between different stock exchanges. But let's say that stock exchanges by themselves are not enough. In Shanghai, for instance, there is a very important stock exchange, but what we need now is a series of additional structural elements. The current system needs to be reformed because it does nothing for our countries, and I'm thinking of ratings, insurance, reinsurance. Mr. Shokin talked about a possible scenario based on digital currencies and gold. Now, you know that in China and India, these currencies have been banned, cryptocurrencies have been banned. I don't think that this scenario could work. As for gold, Russia and China are the largest producers of gold. The gold extracted is bought mainly by India and China. This is what's happened in the past 20 years. So we don't know how much physical bank is kept in Western banks. Maybe we could create this kind of architecture, but it would take a long time and a lot of political effort as well. We know, based on previous experiences, that this is a process that requires a long time. It took America dozens of years to replace the British pound with the US dollar. We also need a system of protective measures in order to support the ruble. The ruble is the core currency in Eurasian trade. We have an excess production of many resources. Often 2/3 of some of our products are exported. But we have an excess production. In the case of fertilizers, what we export would be enough to feed hundreds of thousands of people in the world. The same is true for uranium and other minerals. Now, I am about to conclude. We need to give up mechanisms that no longer work. In China, the export of gold is banned, and so the Chinese buy gold. Europe now doesn't know how to pay for the energy resources of Russia. Maybe it doesn't want to do it, but according to calculations, it takes about 1,000 tons of gold to liquidate the trade balance deficit with Russia. And the central bank also needs to build its gold reserves without worrying about the formal limitations that exist, such as 20% and no more gold in your reserves. So these are all things that need to be overcome if we want to create an alternative model. China, for instance, have accumulated reserves for 2 years in the form of food and metals. We could follow the same example as well to have a robust economy. Thank you. Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview. Now we are talking about a dangerous topic because all previous crises were triggered by the financial sector, by banks, or by reckless debtors. The crisis that we are seeing today in the West is probably due to inflation. So, Mr. Kreiner, I have a question for you. What can macroeconomy impact the financial system? How can this process further develop? And is there a risk to see a systemic reaction that can lead to a change in the financial market?
Yes, my question is, how do you see macroeconomics will influence financial system in the situation when inflation is so high and there are other risks in the financial system? And do you expect any chain reaction which will bring us to a new financial crisis?
Thank you. So I wanted to address the systemic problems of modern financial systems, which often lead to some of today's problems. And I will include a small lesson in macroeconomics, but please don't worry, it'll be all done in less than 7 minutes. So today the Western world is experiencing a profound economic, social and political crisis. We could attribute this crisis to a number of factors: too much debt, supply chain issues, energy crisis, inflation, and also a seemingly insatiable appetite for war. But most of these problems are only symptoms of a structural crisis that stems from a fatal flaw in today's monetary system based on fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking means that the amount of credit banks can provide to the economy is many times greater than the loss-absorbing capacity that they have. Economies based on fractional reserve creation, credit creation, can only be stable as long as they grow. Otherwise, they inevitably fall into recessions or depressions with rising bankruptcy and high unemployment. The flaws of fractional reserve banking have been obvious in the past centuries, as they have frequently led to bank failures. Central banking has made banks more resilient and less vulnerable to failure. However, it did not change the nature of the system, nor its tendency to generate crises. Today, central banking draws roots from the Bank of England. When the British Parliament passed the Bank of England Act, it gave the Bank of England monopoly on issuing Britain's money. That was in 1833. Over the remaining 67 years of the 19th century, Britain spent 32 years in recessions, depressions, bankruptcy, or financial collapse, including a 22-year-long depression from 1873 to 1896. Misery at home went hand in hand with building up of a vast empire abroad. In fact, there is a strong cause and effect relationship between the money system today and a society's appetite for war. US Congressman Ron Paul said that it is no accident that a century of total war coincided with a century of central banking. In June of 2014, a group of American researchers published an article in the American Journal of Public Health. They found that since the end of World War II, the United States launched more than 80% of all military conflicts in the world. This fact does require an explanation. Do the American people enjoy going to war? That is certainly not true. For decades now, the American people have strongly tended to vote for anti-war candidates. Even George W. Bush campaigned in 2000, promising a humble foreign policy and an end to nation building. The West's war addiction is related to an obscure and poorly understood economic phenomenon called the deflationary gap. American historian Carol Quigley wrote that deflationary gap was the key to 20th century economic crisis and one of the three central cores of the whole tragedy of the 20th century. To understand the deflationary gap, let's consider an economic system that produces a certain quantity of goods and services. The total of all the price tags attached to these goods and services represent the aggregate costs of producing them plus profits. That money is income to those who receive it and represents the economy's total purchasing power. On the whole, aggregate costs, aggregate incomes, and aggregate prices are all the same because they represent different sides of the same transactions. For the system to be in balance, aggregate prices should exactly absorb the system's total purchasing power. The problem arises because people normally prefer to save a part of their income, which reduces the total purchasing power available in the system. That shortfall of purchasing power is the deflationary gap. But in today's monetary system, it makes it imperative for an economy to grow. If it doesn't grow, it inevitably generates crises. It's what William Corbett called starvation in the midst of abundance. To ensure growth, governments are forced to intervene and restore sufficient purchasing power through government spending. The best way for governments to intervene is to invest in productive capital goods, since this will increase in national wealth and in standards of living. But in the West, this approach tends to provoke ideological opposition, since it's regarded as socialism. Instead, Western nations seem to prefer the most dangerous method of bridging the deflationary gap, military spending, because it can easily be justified on the grounds of national security and patriotism. Military spending enhances the wealth of political power of the military-industrial complex, as well as its influence over a nation's foreign policy. We can clearly see this in the recent history of the United States. Its military spending amounted to approximately 1% of the gross domestic product during the first 40 years of the last century. That's excluding the World War I. After the Second World War, this has increased by almost 5 times. But my remarks here are not intended as a criticism of the United States. Any nation that adopts the modern fractional reserve money system is vulnerable. As I mentioned earlier, the evolution of this system can be traced back to the Bank of England. The bank was established in 1694. Over the following 120 years, England prosecuted fully 18 officially declared wars against her then rival, France. Back in those days, the British hated France almost as much as they hate Russia today. But hatred does not arise from the common man. Its roots stem from the monetary system that has evolved for nearly 500 years now. The purpose of my remarks here was to highlight the systemic flaw that has led human societies in a direction most people did not want. Many of us in the West now recognize Eurasian integration as a new hope for humanity, a crossroads where we can choose a different path of development. We can replace hatred with love of mankind, war with constructive cooperation and mutual respect. The leadership of Russia and China inspire confidence that this future is now possible, but it will depend on all of us to make sure that we can shape it for the benefit of our children and their children. And finally, to address the problem of inflation, I think inflation inevitably arises from government interventions in modern economies. It is always obliged to grow, and it generates unpayable debt, which then in turn generates inflation. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. Вот так мы тоже перешли к концу, к проблемам гуманизма тоже. Так что все близко в этом мире. Ну, будем завершать сейчас.
Well, thank you. It seems that this world is very small, so it's time to conclude. We cannot create complex situations, but it's important to exchange experiences and opinions and be ready for new challenges and be ready to react to new challenges. It's been a pleasure to listen to our panelists. I would like to thank you, all dear colleagues, for your ability to share your opinions and information. I would like to thank the audience for their kind attention, and see you again in Verona.